Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan and around the region. I'm Sally Jensen. The United Nations highest court could turn the tides for climate justice, as a group of law students from across the Pacific Islands are seeking redress for the climate crisis from the developed world. It's the first time states are being challenged to tackle climate change under international law, and could allow nations most vulnerable to its effects, like small Pacific islands, to hold other countries accountable. To discuss this further, we're joined today by Vishal Prasad, the campaign director of the Pacific Islands Students Fighting Climate Change. Vishal, it's a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Sally. It's a pleasure to be here.
We'll get to what this means for those most at risk from climate change in a bit. But first, let's zoom in on your personal experience. You grew up in Fiji, a Pacific Island country of just under 1 million people. How have Fiji and neighboring countries felt the impact of climate change?
Personally, I have witnessed some of the most deadliest and strong storms in my life in Fiji, in Suva, while living here. We've had Category 5 storms that used to be once in a decade kind of occurrences become frequent every year. We've had about 3 of these Category 5 cyclones in the past few years. One that was particularly devastating, the strongest storm to hit the southern hemisphere, made landfall in Fiji in 2016, I believe, Tropical Cyclone Winston, which had extremely devastating impacts. It wiped away 1/3 of the country's GDP within a matter of hours. There were a number of lives lost. Complete islands and communities were washed away because their homes had been devastated. And it became a huge humanitarian disaster afterwards. So Fiji has identified close to, I should say, more than 40 villages that are going to be relocated or needing relocation as a result of climate change.
And when did you begin to notice that the rest of the world wasn't experiencing climate change in the same way as your countries were? And how did it become a sort of justice issue for you?
The biggest push for our campaign is to get greater climate justice. So if we look at the countries that are suffering the most as a result of climate change, it's those that have contributed the least to causing the problem of climate change. The Pacific countries, for example, contribute less than 1% to global greenhouse gas emissions. That's less than a fraction of what is causing the problem. But on the other hand, the countries that are causing the problem, the developed world, the large polluting countries, they are not at the front lines. They're not experiencing the impacts of climate change as severely as the most vulnerable communities out there in the world, the island nations, the small island, the least developing countries. The impacts of climate change, however, are becoming more apparent in all countries, but the injustice of this is that countries that are least equipped to face these impacts, countries that are least equipped to adapt or deal with loss and damage, deal with these cyclones and floods, are the ones who have not caused the problem and also do not have the resources and the ability to adequately deal with it.
You and other students saw these things happening in your home country. How did you decide to take action? What was the inception of your initiative?
Well, it started in the classrooms at the University of the South Pacific in Vanuatu in 2019 by a group of 27 law students. And when this idea came about from that classroom, we started writing letters to all Pacific leaders, asking them whether they'd be interested in taking this issue of climate change to the world's highest court. And so the government of Vanuatu was the first to respond positively. And so since 2019, Vanuatu has led this initiative. And so the path to taking the problem of climate change to the ICJ requires the UN General Assembly to adopt a resolution. Only then the ICJ can issue an opinion. So the UN General Assembly must vote on the matter. And then after you've secured a majority vote, that's 97 countries, then the matter can be referred to the ICJ. And it was a historic adoption. For the first time in the UN's history, an advisory opinion received 132 co-sponsors, and it was adopted by consensus. So we didn't need 97 countries. We had the whole UN General Assembly's member states support the resolution. So there were no opposition to this matter. And so it was historic. After the adoption at the General Assembly, this was taken to the ICJ, where we're in the phase where countries are now making submissions to the court on the legal question in the resolution.
And so, why did you decide to go to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ? Can you tell us what it does?
So the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. It settles matters of dispute between countries, but it also has an advisory function where it provides legal guidance and clarity on a matter of on a legal issue or a legal question that is put to it. So our campaign has asked the ICJ two questions. The first legal question is asking the ICJ to clarify what are the legal obligations of countries under international law to protect people and planet simply. And the second question is asking the ICJ to clarify what are the legal consequences if countries fail to meet their obligations and fail to protect the climate system or cause significant harm to the climate system. For the longest time, this has been guided by the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC processes and conventions. And so what we've seen is that this is not sufficient to curb the climate crisis. And countries have used a large amount, a lot of loopholes to get around what they need to do in combating the climate crisis. So what we're asking the court to do in this instance is to clarify the legal obligations that states have under a variety of international law and not just be limited to the Paris Agreement or the UNFCCC, but look at human rights law, for example.
You know, what has changed in the past decade or so? Because Palau has also pushed for an ICJ advisory opinion in 2011. So what's different now?
Well, the situations are quite different now. The information, there's a lot more information, there's a lot more understanding among people and governments about the severity of climate change. Particularly within climate vulnerable countries, there is now a sense of urgency, and a lot of countries are looking at all possible opportunities. And so, what's helped is that the science has become more clear. The development of international law is a much better space to push this further. And we have got countries who are far more capable in taking this forward in the sense that there is much more support provided from other countries. Or in the case of Vanuatu, there was the Pacific Islands Forum that was able to provide this support. And so the idea and the time that it's now placed in is best and has propelled this forward. So I think a lot of these issues coming together has allowed this campaign to move quite successfully and quite quickly into what it is right now.
Now let's zoom out to understand what the impact of this will be on our world. An advisory opinion is not necessarily legally binding. So are we really likely to see changes in states' behavior after it's produced?
The opinion itself is not legally binding, but what the ICJ does is provide a clarity or clarify a matter of law. And so the law that it will clarify is legally binding on countries. And so we will be able to take this back to negotiation tables in the UNFCCC at the Conference of Parties, etc., and urge countries to meet their obligations under international law. Negotiations are one avenue to hold countries to account. Courts are another avenue, and countries and organizations, individuals are increasingly using courts as a way to hold countries to account. And so, with the security of a clarified international position that supports the obligations of countries and the consequences of countries, and making that very clear, it will help all of these cases to find climate justice far more quickly and far more urgently. And so there is a much better chance of achieving climate justice and holding countries to account with an advisory opinion in our hands.
We're more than a year from the passing of the UN resolution, and the court has begun proceedings but are still some way off producing this advisory opinion. So when the ICJ does produce it, how can it be used to achieve climate justice?
What we are advocating for is that the ICJ to clarify what are the consequences, particularly in our case, we are interested in ensuring that there is a consequence of cessation, which means ceasing the harmful conduct, stop fossil fuels, stop polluting the environment. That is the cause, the root cause of it. And through this opinion, we need to make that firmly clear as a matter of legal argument. The second is providing reparations. The idea that if there is a harm suffered, there needs to be reparations, there needs to be restitution, there needs to be compensation, and other forms of reparations that are enshrined in international law. Now, what can the ICJ's opinion do? The first is that it can really ratchet up ambition, accountability, and fairness within existing systems. This is immensely lacking at this point. And so, with the ICJ's opinion, it can plug in the gaps that exist within the Paris Agreement, within existing frameworks around this, so that countries are compelled to act and meet the 1.5-degree target, for example, or meet the $100 billion goal, or other goals and targets that are set under the UNFCCC in multilateral spaces. So one of these is going to plug in the gaps. The second very big impact this will have is in international cases and adjudications that are currently happening. There's an exponential rise in climate litigation around the world, and the guidance of the World Highest Court will be very helpful in providing climate justice to these plaintiffs that bring these cases, but also provide a consistent approach to how we apply international law in relation to climate.
For small island nations like Fiji and Vanuatu or other countries with populations at high risk of climate change, could you give an example of how they might deploy this advisory opinion and what results you hope they would see?
So what this advisory opinion can do is provide clarity. One of the things I should mention is to provide clarity on the role and responsibility of developed countries to provide climate finance to these developing countries in order for them to adapt, in order for them to meet these challenges that they're facing. It should not be on these developing countries to take loans whenever a cyclone hits their country to meet the damage and destruction or to repair, but it should be the responsibility of these large polluting countries that have caused these damages to be able to provide the climate finance that is needed. But the second is also to the advisory opinion will be a strong tool in the arsenal of these developing countries, these frontline communities, to push for a cessation of fossil fuel use, to stop the use of fossil fuels. Because we can talk about adapting, we can talk about mitigating the impacts, but if we're not addressing the root cause of the problem, we're not going anywhere. And so with this ICJ advisory opinion, you have one more tool, one more authoritative guideline by the world's highest court to push countries to stop the use of fossil fuels, but also provide climate finance.
While Taiwan is also a small island nation, it's on the higher end. As you say, it's one of these countries that contributes more to greenhouse gas emissions per capita. It produces roughly 15 times than that of Vanuatu. So what would your message be to countries like Taiwan that are significantly contributing to climate change?
What we would say, and what the Pacific has been saying to all large developed countries remains the same, is that the Pacific and many vulnerable countries face an existential problem. But this problem is not going to be unique to just the Pacific or many of these island countries. It is now spreading all around the world. We're seeing droughts, we're seeing floods, wildfires, and impacts manifest in many different forms. And so we often say that the world is an island, that this is a problem that is for all of humanity to deal with. So this issue is not going to be isolated to just the Pacific. Taiwan and all other developed countries, all other polluting countries will one day have to face, if not facing now. And so the sooner we move towards a fossil fuel-free future, towards a just transition, and to meeting our obligations under international law, the better it will be for all of humanity.
Thanks so much for your insights, Vishal. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you, Sally. Wonderful to be here.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from TaiwanPlus, you can follow our social media. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.